Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Adam Klasfeld, editor-in-chief of All Rise News. I'm very excited today to welcome Professor Jamie Rowen, an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, scholar of legal studies and political science, and an author of a must-read article, which I will include in the show notes after our conversation that was printed in The Conversation about the upcoming D-Day protests happening on Friday. Across the country, but in Washington, D.C., she was just telling me that tens of thousands of people are expected. That will take place in the National Mall with musical entertainment from Dropkick Murphys, who are always involved in charitable causes. And just to set the stage for us, Jamie, if you can tell us what to expect on Friday. What are these D-Day protests that are coming up ahead?
So at 2 p.m. on the National Mall, there's supposed to be a march from on the National Mall. And there, at the time I wrote the article, 16 capitals, not in the sense of the capital of the states, but actually at the Capitol buildings in 16 different states, there were protests planned. And there were about 130 other protests planned. That was a few days ago. I just got updates from my local Indivisible group that there was a protest planned in my town, which means that the numbers are exploding as people realize that these D-Day protests have an opportunity to join veterans in speaking out about what the executive branch is doing to the United States institutional structure. And so I think the protests are meant to be led by veterans, to have veterans pointing to the importance of their voice. They've been arguing against what they see as an authoritarian turn by the executive. They're also very concerned about their benefits. The federal government has been slashing benefits spending, and veterans' benefits are expensive. And so their benefits have been on the chopping block. And more importantly for veterans, even though they're only 6% of the U.S. population, they make up 24% of the federal workforce. And that's actually one of the biggest problems, is that as the federal government has indiscriminately slashed jobs, veterans are especially hard hit because they are overrepresented in the federal workforce. And that's due to a law that was passed in 1944 that says that when the federal government is hiring, if two applicants are equal, a veteran should be hired over the other veteran, DEI for veterans, affirmative action for veterans, I should say. And that if you are laying off federal workers, veterans should be the last laid off. And it's not clear that the federal government is following that law when they are indiscriminately letting go of federal workers.
And I find that a really fascinating insight of your essay, because we've been talking about the slash and grab of the federal government by Elon Musk, and who's now departed ways with Donald Trump and this acrimonious divorce, talking about the budget bill being this monstrosity. But through this discussion about the gutting of the federal government, there's been little discussion about the fact that a lot of veterans have been affected by this. Can you talk a little bit more about that, how they're disproportionately represented among the people in the federal government whose jobs have been lost here?
Sure. So as I just said, in 1944, Congress passed a law designed to help veterans enter the civilian workforce because they lost employment opportunities by serving, and many of them were disabled. And so it's a way to also privilege those that might be disabled and have trouble getting jobs elsewhere to be able to take the benefits from the federal government in employment. And so what we saw in the first 100 days of the Trump administration was a real outcry from the veterans community when people with skills, experience, service, and sacrifice were getting terminated without any reason. And that was the modus operandi of that so-called Department of Government Efficiency. Veterans did get attention from mass media. I saw articles in Newsweek, for example, about this. And Democrats and Republicans were responding. And so there were actually competing bills put forth and some bipartisan bills put forth to make sure that the federal government was honoring its obligation to veterans in particular as part of the federal workforce. But what really escalated the concern among congressmen and anyone who cares about veterans affairs was a memo that was leaked a couple months ago that said the Department of Veterans Affairs is looking to slash 83,000 jobs. And 83,000 jobs from the VA, which is a massive bureaucracy, it employs almost 500,000 people, is still a significant amount of people when you consider that 90% of those people are providing healthcare to veterans. And so what the veterans are seeing is a real threat to their healthcare and their benefits and the workforce that's needed to administer those. It goes directly against a law that was passed by Congress in 2022 to expand veterans' benefits to people who suffered from particular illnesses during the global war on terror. And so there's 1 million new claims for medical care that the VA has been processing, and it has been increasing its efficiency. It's doing a much better job since the Biden administration figured out how to streamline hiring and improve the workforce. And so cutting that many jobs, veterans know what that means for the quality of their healthcare. So they're standing up. What I find interesting to add is their efforts in that time period did seem to have an effect on the, quote, big, beautiful bill that Trump put forward, because he is suggesting that he will increase the budget of the VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs, by 4%. But most of that money is actually going to help with the transition to electronic health records, the rollout of which has been extremely problematic. And Doug Collins, who is the secretary of the Department of Veteran Affairs, continues to talk about the need for cutting employees, many of whom themselves are veterans, and many of whom we know are directly serving veterans.
Mm. And one of the things that I saw one of the organizers of the DC protests calling attention to was a proposal to rename Veterans Day by Trump. Can you talk a little bit about that and the reaction to that in the veterans community?
It's an area that I'm not quite familiar with. I think that what veterans are concerned about is that the Trump administration does not seem to care about veterans. He has expressed disrespect for military service and disdain, and the veterans know that. And so every step that he takes to rename a holiday from veterans, which is how this group of people identifies, is going to be seen as an example of his disrespect that he then tries to hide because he knows that it's a political liability to do disrespectful things to the military and to veterans.
Right. Well, talking about the kind of political fallout of this, does the fact that these government cuts, these purges, have disproportionately affected veterans, what has been the fallout of it? You mentioned it a little bit earlier that there's talk on Capitol Hill, both Republicans and Democrats trying to address it. Obviously, Trump won huge majorities of veterans in 2024. What's been the political blowback of these unpopular policies with the veteran community?
As I said, the memo that leaked that said 83,000 jobs was going to be cut was quickly set aside. And the Department of Veterans Affairs have lost less than 1% of its workforce, whereas other agencies like USAID or public media have lost upwards of 90%. And the Department of Education, for example, is being threatened with being closed. So the VA has made out well because the veterans mobilize and they have a lot of power with Congress members, and there's bipartisan support. They're one of the few groups in this country that maintain bipartisan support. And when they come out en masse, Congress responds.
Hmm. And so your article actually goes into a little bit of the history of organized veterans protests. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it relates to the ones that are coming up on Friday?
Yeah, so veterans were a group that was not politically popular when this country was founded. People who had to go into military service, it was especially if they were soldiers, not officers. This wasn't a politically popular or socially popular or culturally popular thing to do. But after the Civil War, when it was clear that veterans had put their bodies on the line to save the Union, the federal government recognized that they owe these people money and that the veterans themselves realized that they could start making demands on the federal government. And they started to organize collectively, became a pretty powerful interest group. And the patronage politics at the time meant that if a particular interest group had a lot of votes, the president should pay attention. And so Grover Cleveland in 1887, for example, vetoed a bill that Congress had passed to expand pension benefits for veterans, and the veterans mobilized and they were able to get him out of office. And they brought in a new president, Harrison, along with a Republican Congress to pass a very generous Benefits Act in 1890. And by 1900, 40% of the federal budget was for veterans support. Of course, incoming administrations were concerned about that dollar amount. And so they would attempt to pare back those benefits. And every time the veterans would mobilize and become more vocal, and they were still engaged in lobbying. Their tactics shifted in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And the reason is that after World War I, thousands of veterans came back, and Congress didn't have the money at the time to give veterans the benefits they thought they deserved. And so they passed a law that said that in 1945, the veterans would get back pay from their time of service in World War I, that the Congress was going to invest money at the time in bonds, they were going to accrue, they were going to increase in value, and they would release that money in 45. Well, in 1929, the stock market crashed, and veterans were hard hit by unemployment, just like the rest of the country. And what they decided to do was a public spectacle. From May until July 1932, they came to Washington, D.C. and set up encampments. 40,000 veterans set up encampments all over the city. They crowded Congress to force them to debate whether to release the money at the time. And Herbert Hoover, who was president at the time, made a huge political miscalculation. He thought that he would have the authority politically and socially and the legitimacy to call in the National Guard to physically remove these poor veterans demanding their back pay. And what it looked like was Herbert Hoover not caring about the poor people of America, and particularly those who fought for freedom.
Mm.
And so that effort by Hoover directly contributed to his electoral defeat and Franklin Delano Roosevelt's win in 1932. Roosevelt then immediately tried to pare back veterans' benefits again because of the expense and the problems of the Great Depression. But veterans mobilized, and they had, again, public events all over the country. And the federal government said, this is not a population that we want to anger. And so Delano Roosevelt and Congress rescinded the cuts. Veterans maintained their benefits throughout the Great Depression. And FDR realized after World War II that if he didn't think about how to support veterans returning from World War II, he could have another major political problem on his hands. And that directly contributed to the GI Bill, what is known as the GI Bill, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. And that was the most generous expansion of federal benefits ever. The educational benefits that 2.2 million veterans took advantage of. And it created the modern middle class and the booming U.S. economy from 1950 to 1970.
Mm. And it sounds like a through line in all that history that you were mentioning is ignore the mass power and organized power of veterans at your peril, political peril here. We're now in Pride Month, and one of the populations that has been, veterans populations that has been targeted by the Trump administration is transgender military officers and service members. Can you speak a little bit on that? Do you know to what extent that this population been part of the mass organizing effort that's going to lead to these hundreds of protests on Friday?
You know, it's interesting. Among the organizers, that's not the group that's leading it. The group that's leading it are the unions. It's the people who represent the people who see themselves as workers that are leading this protest. That's the group. Transgender service members are absolutely affected. So are gay service members. We just heard that the Navy wants to rename a ship from Harvey Milk, who was a decorated Army Navy veteran. They want to change the name of the ship. It's insulting. I mean, it's not necessary, even if you're trying to dismantle DEI, to do something that is so flagrantly against the LGBT community. The number of transgender service members has really ballooned in the past decade. We're now somewhere around 11,000 people who identify as transgender in the military that are looking for medical benefits. And the new policies say that those service members and veterans are not able to access medical care for their gender affirming treatments. And that's a really big problem. There's a huge problem. And the research that is being done that could be done on veterans with gender dysphoria is also not being done. And this is creating a huge problem. I don't see that group as active in this particular organizing, but I anticipate they might be there. One of the things that's most interesting and powerful about the veteran community is its diversity. And so, even though joining the military and coming back from the military has created some racial disparities in terms of Black service members returning after the World Wars to the Jim Crow South and not having the same access to benefits that the white soldiers had, or the construction of a veteran identity that's really rooted in a sort of white identity that left out really the sacrifices of Black soldiers. It is an institution that brings people all over the country together into a shared mission where those different identities melt away and people are actually able to work together. And when they leave, they've had exposure across those socio-demographic differences. And that's a really important thing that the military offers people. And because of that, I think it'll be really important to see at these protests how these different groups are working together. One of the things that's very interesting about this group is that it does vote Republican. And it's not clear to me that they necessarily support Trump, but political partisanship is so strong in this country that if you identify as a Republican, you vote for the Republican candidate, even if that Republican candidate has expressed disdain for veterans and service members. But there is a quite progressive tilt to these particular protests. And it's one of the things that I find fascinating about studying veterans benefits is that the same political rhetoric against socialism is tricky when you're talking about the only group of people that get federally funded education, healthcare, and housing benefits. And so they have to toe this really interesting political line on their identities as veterans, but also their demands on the federal government.
Mm. It's interesting. Early on in my career, I covered the court martial of Chelsea Manning, and of course, hers was one of the first cases where there was national attention to transgender people in the military. There was a high-profile legal battle over her access to transgender health care in prison. I think I was one of the first to report on that one, but the issue has become much more mainstream since that time. And former President Barack Obama, of course, under his administration, there was open service for transgender soldiers, and one of the things that has been very interesting in following this litigation is to see just how essential. What essential roles within the military transgender officers have been serving. A lot of that is now part of an open and public record. And to your point, it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out in these protests and in organized political power among veterans groups going ahead. I want to turn your attention to something that will be in the news very much 1 week from now, which is what has been dubbed No King's Day, Trump's military parade that he wants to throw himself on the streets of Washington, D.C., infrastructure be damned. What have you heard from the military community on this? This seems like something that many people who have enlisted didn't anticipate signing up for, throwing a military parade for a president of the United States. That wasn't the oath that many of these people have taken.
Yes, and it's something I continue to be impressed by the military community is that we're a civilian military and their loyalty is to the Constitution. And there's a very strong socialization that occurs in the military against the idea of military dictatorship, because we are, again, a civilian-controlled military, and about the need to have leadership that you respect and that respects you. The people in the military are paying close attention. There's a chain of command. The president is at the top of it, and people in the military are obligated to do what the commander-in-chief says to do, so long as it is legal. But what I learned through these protests is that the veterans community wanted to be uh, focusing their attention on these D-Day protests. The No King's Day protests that are emerging in response to that military march, people have asked me, well, why aren't the veterans marching on that day to speak out against the president? And what I explained to them is they see the symbolism of D-Day. as freedom from fascism and freedom from authoritarianism, and something that they brought to the world, defeating Hitler. And so they wanted to organize their protests on this day, which I think is interesting that it's happening a week prior to what should be also really big protests. But those protests aren't going to be coming and being led by the military. They'll be led by more progressive groups. And the military, people who are in the military or care about that might show up. But they really want these D-Day protests to be their protests where we can bring attention to the plight of the veteran community and their concerns about their benefits and their jobs and the authoritarianism that they see rooted in their own identities.
Right. And I want to turn to, sometimes the commentators have some very good points I want to ask you about. The one of the first things that Pete Hegseth did when he assumed the position was fired a female officer, fired a very accomplished Black general. How has this attack on diversity? We have now a much more diverse military than we did. How will that go toward alienating the community that, as you noted, has traditionally voted Republican?
It's important to understand that the military is going to be 40% people of color in the next 2 decades. And that maps on pretty well to the US population. And so the military has been at the forefront of efforts to do things like integrate, at the forefront of efforts to bring in energy efficient vehicles, right? At the forefront of things that this country needs. I mean, it was the veterans themselves who got themselves pension and disability benefits that formed the foundation of Social Security as we know it in this country, and anything to do with the social welfare state. So I see the military as a harbinger. And it has been an extraordinary institution to bring forward, I would say, this country towards better relations between these different demographic groups that need to be working together. And Pete Hegseth's desire under President Trump's overall plan to divide and conquer is really deeply problematic. And so again, I will see on Friday when I'm there at the rally how this plays out. But on the ground, just by the numbers, it's a problem. The groups that continue to join the military are groups that are in the lower middle classes, and they're people of color, and they don't want to be disrespected. And even the Supreme Court, when it decided to end race-based affirmative action in higher education, said, we are leaving this question about how military educational facilities should be addressing race-based affirmative action, because there might be an argument that we would agree with as to why race-based affirmative action is important in the military for cohesion of the unit, for representation of this country.
And I see a comment about the incompetence that we are seeing. So I want to turn to Hegseth's signal gate. The fact that there was such a massive security breach that you have, one, the use of Signal for to discuss attack plans to begin with, but the inclusion of the top editor at a nationally respected magazine as a participant to this. How has the veterans community reacted to a type of security breach among the top cabinet members for something that I am sure would come with heavy punishment had a rank and file person been involved in it?
Yeah, I don't think veterans are not under direct threat. They have joined the civilian population. They're not serving in the military. The
Right.
people who are the most upset, I would imagine, are the ones serving in the military. And they, of course, aren't able to speak openly and vocally because, again, they respect the chain of command. If you've studied veterans, if you've spent time with people who are active service members, one thing that always strikes me is the way that they are socialized into following rules. And I talk about this a lot when it comes to like the war on terror and detention policies. It was the Department of Defense that stood up against the CIA for torturing detainees, because the people who go through the Department of Defense learn the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They learn the Geneva Conventions. They care about rules. They care about following them. And the military has its own court system to enforce those rules. And so watching somebody at the top break protocol, and it's not just any protocol, it's protocol designed to keep them safe, has to affect morale. So the veterans community, again, is not involved in that. But we are going to see, it's going to be interesting what is going to happen with people enlisting, whether people are going to re-enlist, whether they want to be part of this particular military. It's a tragedy.
Mm. And how can people, if people watching want to get involved in the upcoming D-Day protests, where can they learn that it's happening?
So AmericanOpposition.org is one of the organizers. 5051 is one of the organizers, and and Indivisible is also involved. And so if you look at AmericanOpposition.org, reach out on there. They have a very active group of people that are sharing information about where the protests are. And I hope people show up. One thing that I add to the conversation as a person who did not come to the study of veterans or the military for any particular love of the war machine that exists in the United States and the military industrial complex is that the more you study this group of people, the more you realize that people join the military to get educational access that should be available without joining the military, but they do so with a sense of service and commitment to the country. And those of us that might have different political orientations and might be concerned about the use of military force, but we share that orientation towards what this country means, the opportunities it should be offering its people, and this rule-based order in the Constitution. We share that. And so again, even if we don't identify with the military, we can identify with those values and we can show up in solidarity and support and see our connection.
Mm. And one thing that has been notable about a lot of these protests, where you have dozens, if not hundreds, of different demonstrations across the country, they've been created by everyday people who notice that there are protests in other towns and they organize ones themselves. When we publish this conversation in the All Rise News newsletter, I'll have a link to one of the spreadsheets that show all the places where it's happening. It's happening all across the country. One of the things that I find very surprising, I'm a New Yorker. New York City is a city where lots of mass protests happen. And there's one protest that I'm aware of in New York State, and it's in Canandaigua, a town of 10,000 people. So if there's a protest, if you'd like to attend one of the protests, but there's not one in your area, perhaps you're a potential organizer. Do you have any final thoughts? Thank you for joining us, Professor. Any final thoughts about veterans, the benefits that are under threat, and what the situation might look like in terms of civic engagement for them going forward?
I think that this is a time to create allyship across divides. Faculty members at universities are recognizing that the GI Bill financed higher education in this country and that the university system wouldn't exist without the support that veterans have received. People who care about their health should realize that 70% of their doctors were trained at VA health centers, and that really fundamental medical research on the connection between, for example, lung cancer and cardiovascular disease and smoking, and the Surgeon General's warning on cigarettes came from the VA. The foundations of the CAT scan came from the VA. The testing for prostate cancer came from the VA. So our society has really been impacted by federal investment in veterans and what they have been able to do for the broader community. So this is a time for us to be thinking broadly, and especially about groups like veterans that have bipartisan support. This is what we need. We need to see how to reach out across divides and find our shared values and say that we do not like the direction that this country is turning, and that the small minority that wants to take advantage of their temporary position of power needs to be stopped, and it needs to be stopped every single day.
Thank you very much, Professor. For all those just tuning in now, if you missed a large part of our half-hour discussion, I'll be reposting this in full on allrisenews.com. Subscribe to make sure that you get to see the entire conversation and all the information we've referenced, including the spreadsheet of protests coming up on this D-Day protest in your area. Thank you very much, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Bye bye.